had a father and mother. We owned a small dry goods store selling shoes and clothing. I had no idea of what was to come in the next 2-3 years.
Pearl Harbor was bombed by Japan on December 7, 1941. Executive Order 9066 was signed by President Franklin Roosevelt on February 19, 1942. This forcibly removed ethnic Japanese from the states of California, Oregon, Washington, and Arizona.
We were told that they wanted to remove us as soon as possible because they were afraid we would sabotage or commit espionage. I never knew these words before. We were moved to the relocation center in Arizona.
Executive Order 9066 led to the incarceration of over 100,000 Japanese Americans, of which 2/3 were born in America and 1/3 were children. The camps were built in inhospitable locations where there was lots of snow in the winter and raging heat in the summer.
It was just brutally hot and dry. It would almost get dark. The dust would be swirling that hard. For me, I think that was the worst part.
One American-born citizen of Japanese descent, Fred Korematsu, refused the internment. He was convicted and appealed the case until it reached the Supreme Court in 1944, which upheld the conviction in a 6-3 majority. Justice Hugo Black wrote that public necessity may negate restrictions against the violation of civil rights.
The Supreme Court essentially had to balance between the necessity of taking such a drastic action and the reasons for taking such a drastic action. It's not necessarily a conflict of constitutional principles, it's more of balancing, because in most instances that's what the Supreme Court is doing. They're balancing certain interests against other interests. And they found in this particular case that this was a time of war and the necessity for such an order was of such magnitude that it was constitutional to issue the executive order, which placed Japanese Americans into relocation camps.
The Korematsu case established the strict scrutiny standard and has been used to protect minority rights.
Hirabayashi was a University of Washington student, and his was an instance where he had violated the curfew, and there's a congressional act that made that a crime, and so he challenged that crime. Essentially what they said, that a pressing public necessity may overcome individual rights of a minority group during a time of war.
In 1942, Mitsui Endo filed a habeas corpus petition to challenge the executive order, which was denied by the court a year later. She filed an appeal with the Circuit Court of Appeals, and the case went to the Supreme Court, which ruled 9-0 in favor of Endo, stating that Japanese Americans could not remain detained if the government believed they were loyal to the United States. The war ended, and by the beginning of 1945, Japanese Americans were gradually released from internment camps.
If you went into town, there were signs that said, "No Japs allowed," in front of restaurants, the barbershops, the bars, etc. It was a difficult time for many of the Japanese. There was really outright discrimination.
My grandmother's side, it was the hardest, just because they just had to start over, and it was rough to start over when those around you still did not trust you.
On January 27, 2017, President Donald Trump signed an executive order which banned Syrian refugees from entering the United States, suspended the refugee admissions program for 120 days, and temporarily blocked citizens from 7 Muslim-majority countries from entering the U.S., revoking their visas. The order was signed under the pretense of national security. However, a federal judge ruled it unconstitutional and placed a nationwide restraining order on the ban. Trump issued a modified version of the ban, which was also blocked by a federal judge who claimed that it violated the Establishment Clause, which prohibits the establishment of religion by Congress. This religious discrimination connects to the strict scrutiny standard established in the Korematsu case, which states that any law affecting a racial group must be strictly examined, and the reasons for enacting the law must be at the highest level. During World War II, judicial powers acted to protect the country at the expense of a minority group's rights. Now we are confronted with a similar situation, in which our nation is engaged in war on terror, and we are faced with the same decision. The precedents set forth from the Korematsu, Hirabayashi, and Endo cases encourage us to carefully balance the necessity of the order against the violated constitutional rights.
The executive order, which essentially prohibited citizens of particular countries from entering the United States for a period of time, is raising the same legal principles and the same kind of balancing. I think that if you look at the recent executive order, what it'll come down to on a constitutional challenge is the balancing of the necessity for that action versus the constitutional protections that it invades.
The Constitution establishes the foundation of our rights, but it is up to us to interpret and apply the principles it defines in order to protect these rights. History inevitably repeats itself, but hopefully we have evolved enough to look back at the mistakes our country has made and learn from them.
I wonder what's going to happen next to the country.